We have been looking through this early portion of the book of Colossians, and it is focused primarily on Paul's record of understanding of where those brethren fell, that they are indeed Christians, even though he did not teach them, and that they are equal in their Christianity. It didn't require an apostle to teach them for them to be Christians and to be right with God. That's an important lesson. And then to build off of that, why he was thankful for what they had done, but also in this second kind of section, he was reminding them of where they still needed to go. So if you think about verses 3 through 8 as his thankfulness for what they've done and who they are now, and then 9 through 14 to put into perspective that this is the beginning and here's what this is all about. And you have a lot to do and that God makes possible. And remember that in this, what God has done to make your lives be like this and be possible. So now as we move in, and we're still in a sentence, okay, even though in verse 15, in the New King James, it notes it as a paragraph, and the New Sentence, in actuality, it is actually still continuing that thought. He is building on, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. So the in whom, okay, it says, as a matter of fact, in verse 13, about God who has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of his love. That's the transition to Jesus. And now we have in whom, in Jesus, we have redemption through Jesus' blood, the forgiveness of sins. And now he is at the head, but it is who is. So he is just so that doesn't, if you look in a different translation, it's not that this is wrong, it's just understanding that connection in the Greek. It's still ongoing, kind of a Paul liked long sentences to connect everything together. So this is Jesus, and he says, in describing Jesus, and we're going to be looking at these few phrases, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Now, that's important because he's laying that out as essentially, here's who he is. And the reason why I say that is, if you'll go ahead and look at verse 16, when he says for, or literally it's because, depending upon the translation. So he's 16 and following is giving evidence for why he is these things. But 15 is a statement about, here's who Jesus is. So this one who redeemed you, who provided forgiveness of sins, the one who is the Son of his love, in verse 13, that gave his blood, this is who he is. And he describes him in two ways. And the reason why, I think, I was trying to give some time to this, he starts by saying he is the image of the invisible God. Now, start right now and think about what he's just done literarily, okay? What is an image? It's a picture, right? The word underlying this is icon. Now that goes then through Latin and we end up with icon. Okay? So now you've got, and now it's funny because no one thinks about this hardly anymore, but used to, on your computer, those images that represented the programs or apps, they're icons, right? It's a picture. Okay? That's why, but in religious terms, when we hear icon, in history, it was actually the foundation for a big split because of iconography, and that is whether or not you could have these representations of God in any way and all these things, big split problem. But it had to do with images, or what for them it looked like an idol, but if you go and see the difference between, say, a Catholic church, if you ever visited some of those, versus an Orthodox, you'll see some of the differences. Okay. But that's not even the most interesting thing here. If it's a picture and it's an image, it's something you see. And it's a visible representation then of someone who is invisible. That's a tough one to pull off, isn't it? If you don't think that, try to go to an artist sometime and have them draw you a picture of God. Now, I'm sure they'd be willing to try for the right amount of money, especially if it's abstract. The point here is, though, is in what way can you have an image of one who's invisible? What is actually being portrayed? Characterhood, morality, attributes. It's key in understanding that when Jesus came, he was not reflecting God's image and saying, here is this, God is a short Jewish man, in his 30s, right? We still don't know what Jesus looked like, but that still was not what he's saying about God. So he was reflecting, Jesus was showing who God is, though God is invisible. God is unseeable in that sense, physically. Jesus came to show us by behavior rather than by picture who God is. Now, you certainly see that portrayed, probably more attention given to it throughout the book of John. Right? You see that introduced in John 1 through 18. You see it emphasized in John 14 through 16. And then there are different portions throughout that you see it. But I just want us to get there. Now, this is important for a reason that will become clear, I think, in a moment. John? Mm-hmm. The word? Yes. But I mean, you're dealing with Hebrew and Greek. But yes. And the whole idea is there's some aspect to him. And the distinction here, though, is he is in God's image in a different way than what man is. Even though he became man, he is representative of God to man. Because he's the image of the invisible God, and it is highlighted, try to explain why, but it's highlighted in this that he is here to provide us a greater understanding of one we cannot see. So that in that process, God becomes, in Jesus, more relatable. Would you all agree that that's accomplished? I think it is, because I think people can connect emotionally more easily to Jesus than they can to God. Because of the identification, which Eddie ended with in Hebrews chapter 2, 40-50, because he became a man. We can identify with him in ways we cannot identify with the Father. Now, that can cause us some problems sometimes because of confusing the why and not appreciating the unity within the Godhead. But it's that identification of, this is saying that's why. To show us, here's who God is, and that that perfect character could still exist in this kind of form, lived out in a life, while still being God. And that's actually the key thing he's pointing out here. Yes, he is a man. But in character and who he was showing himself to be more than man. Because he shares those characteristics of an invisible God. Now, he's needing to show this, and the reason why that's the point is going to come up in verse 16 when he talks about creation. Okay? But now look, and here's the transition between them, is this second phrase. The firstborn over all creation. Now, some older translations, you might have firstborn of all creation. Okay, now that's what it says. I think the New King James is right in terms of how it's presenting it, because there are limits with what the Greek cases could do. Firstborn over all creation. So what do we end up having some people say from this? What are the possible meanings of that? That he was a created being. He's the first. Okay, so he was a created being, but he's the first one created, right? And there are certain religious groups that certainly hold that position, right? And I think that people would come back and argue it partially from this, okay? But that is at the same time, contextually with what it's about to say, that doesn't work. Instead, it's saying he is, again, firstborn, and this is where I want us to think. What does firstborn bring up? What ideas? See, when we say firstborn of all creation, we say, well, that means he was the first one created. That means we are concentrating on one aspect of the word. Say it again. He was the heir. That's correct. He is actually reigning as co-regent because he's heir. And it can only be a co-regency. Anyone understand the idea of what? You've got the one who is the king, but he has his co-regent when he has elevated his heir in anticipation. Now, what's the situation, though, with God and the Son in terms of inheritance? At what time does the co-regent become the regent? When the father dies. Is that going to happen? No. So he's operating then on this framework of being that heir, okay, as serving now as co-regent, which is what the talk about giving him the authority, and we looked at in 1 Corinthians 15 about having the kingdom. That's why. So when he's saying he's firstborn, tying this together in a context where he's first talking about being this image of the invisible God and then going to talk about participating in creation, it is not he's created, it is he's the one who has, because of his relationship with God, just mentioned, he has right and rule over creation. And that's why it's translated that way in the New King James. Now, as we move now into verse 16, I want you to note what he has done. The first half of 15 is actually a demonstration of his relationship with the Father, God the Father. The second part is his relationship with creation. So it is presenting Jesus as this one who has this relationship with both, that we know is true, but a lot of times we don't appreciate in this kind of situation. He's now got to define that role. Okay, now as we move in to verse 16, I want to read it, and then we need to give some background. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. Wow, there's a lot in that verse. But here's the beginning of the explanation, the reasons why he could say what he just said. That he shows the characteristics of being God. Well, if you create, that's pretty much it, isn't it? Okay, simple way to view this, and I didn't used to think it'd be that hard and needed, but I think nowadays it is. How much power does it take to create something from nothing? Thank you. It's not that hard a question, is it? It takes all power. It also takes all knowledge to be able to come up with it, what you're going to do, right? So you got to have, and you also have someone place to put it, so you got to have all present. So that's kind of a trifecta. Okay, so to be able to create requires attributes that only God can have. That's important and why he does this. So it's saying he is in a position in why he can do things only God can do. You cannot have a created being creating because he cannot have the characteristics necessary to do so. When he says then, for by him, though, now we have to clarify it. Literally, because by means of him. Now, that's an important word here because if we go back to Genesis and when he says right away, all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, doesn't your mind immediately go to Genesis 1:1? You should. I think it's an allusion to that. Okay, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, and if you want to know, heavens here is plural. Okay, heavens, all things that are in the heavens, okay, which gives it a different kind of feel to it. Now, there are two things, and we need to go background now to appreciate why is this coming up? Why would you need to deal with, you're writing newer Christians, they believe in God, they believed in Jesus, and they had to believe who Jesus was, the Son of God, in order to become Christians, right? But now he feels it important to come on the scene and start talking about emphasizing who Jesus is. And this is going to come up again in chapter 2 in the section that is specific to more specific to the problems they were getting into. And in our introduction, remember, I pointed out that those problems had a Jewish origin. So what does that mean? It means that there were some Jews that were influencing or trying to influence the Colossians to believe some things about Jesus that were not true, and that he was less than God. Not surprising for Jews to argue that, right? When it says by means of, for by him, the by means, okay, he was in some way intermediary. Now this is interesting because we just talked about how you have to have the power and the presence and the knowledge of God in order to create. But you have him creating as an intermediary. That is, God, by saying this, if this was created by means of him, he's operating the means, then someone else is the force, the original part, and then he carries it out. What does that automatically tell us then? You had to have God. You had to have God in creation, and then Jesus, who is God, also in creation, being means. So one not being means, and the other being means, but yet both creating. Is that confusing enough? So you have to have, the only way that works is if there's Godhead. That's the only way that works. You can't go by that. You're right, but you can't go by that. So when he says this and does this, all things were created. Okay, so again, the idea of fiat creation, out of nothing, ex nihilo. He is participating in this. So now we go back when he says then that are in heaven and that are on earth. He's taken us all the way back to Genesis and saying that in Genesis 1, Jesus was part of that. Now, trying to define where that line is, we have the Spirit mentioned in verse 2. Spirit moved on the face of the waters. So what do you have? This is not a big deal, so don't worry. But you have, hold on, John. You have in the mind of God this, what we're going to do, and then this plan, and now the means comes in to enact the plan. So somewhere in statements, and obviously before that with a statement was made in Genesis 1:1, but in the next part, let there be light, and there was light. Is the Father saying that, and then Jesus doing it, or God planted and Jesus says it and it's done? Doesn't matter, but I want to give you an idea of this participation in creation that's going on here. What is he intending to communicate when he says all things were created that are in heaven and that are on the earth? What is that trying to get across? All encompassing? Okay. If it's an allusion to Genesis, then what is it saying was done then? Okay, but what does that mean? What's included in that? He's the one who did it, yes. I mean, if we think about heaven being God's dwelling place, did God not have a home before? Okay, no, God doesn't need an actual place. He just has exist. So the place in Genesis, what's being made is the expanse, physically speaking, right? So the idea of skies, and this is one of those ideas Caleb and I were talking with. The idea here of sky, it's kind of, we've lost it a little bit. Heavens has the idea of the skies above you, or whatever's beyond you. Now remember, especially in an ancient context, okay, and we don't have to go back that far. Okay, I know we're all about space and things now, but flight was beyond them. So the sky was beyond. The night sky was really beyond. God was beyond that. Okay. So when the idea of this being created, he created all this, it was that encompassing of the universe. Then he says, visible and invisible. He comes back to invisible. Okay, now if God is, now let's show how tortured people can reason with Scripture when you take things out of context. Okay, it says that God is invisible, right? That's verse 15. And in verse 16 it says that Jesus created things that are invisible. So that means that Jesus created God. I didn't say it was logical. I said that's how tortured some people's logic is. Okay, I'm showing what you can do if you don't care about context. If you just want to do words. Okay, so there's a context that's set for what he's talking about in creation. And but he lays out visible and invisible. So the visible, that can be a lot of different things, right? He made these things, he made us. We can see that tangible, but there are a lot of things we can't see that he also made. Now, we're going to come up on a question about how far this extends, but it certainly covers like down to the microscopic level, at the nuclear level, which we'll get to in a moment. And it also extends, there are things that I don't care how big a telescope you've got, you can't see. They're still there. So the whole idea is that down to the microscopic level, to the telescopic level, all of that in physical creation was made by God. What you can see and what you cannot see. John. It's making it. Had to be for there to be more left over, right? Now we get, so you cover everything. Then we get to, and this is the question that comes up when he says invisible, because of the next phrasing. Whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. So what are thrones, dominions, principalities, and powers? Any kind of position of authority? That's what they all have in common, isn't it? Okay, good. I think that's a worthwhile option. Kingdoms would fall into that category. Now, in a sense, you go and say, well, in what way is that created? Now, it says in Romans chapter 13 that government was made by God, right? Now, but that's not exactly these things, though these are all expressions. When you look at thrones, there is a progression, I will say. These words are found in two different contexts in the literature. Okay? One is governmental and one is supernatural, okay, in the Jewish literature. So what you have here is thrones, okay, that's the king or emperor, right? Dominions, that's lordships, so that's kind of your next step down. Principalities, areas of rule, okay, so next level down, and then powers or technically authorities, so the people who are in charge of like enforcement. So if you go down, you could say this, all kind of power, and this is the idea of power in its authority. So you have an expression of power over physical things, but now this is actually over men, expressing it over men. In which case you would go down from the top, okay, so you go federal level, down to state level, down to county level, city level. It's all covered. Is that there's no authority greater. He's the one that has the authority from which these spring. Okay, so that's one thing. Then you have the other, which is actually, the second one is probably far more prominent among commentators and theologians. Believe that this is a reference to angels. Okay? And this is found, these references are found, though not often, within the literature of what's called the Second Temple Judaism period, which is, we call it intertestamental period. Okay? So from the time, basically from the literature, Second Temple was rebuilt by Zerubbabel, and then with Ezra coming back right after, so it was basically Zerubbabel. And then you have that, and that all becomes the Second Temple. This literature they're talking about, though, is not biblical literature. It's the pseudepigrapha and the apocrypha. So all this that mainly was written from the time period from Antiochus Epiphanes, when they were in rebellion, okay, that's about 175 BC, to their time, and it continued on through up to the first century. Okay, but they were writing things, but there's a lot of it written. Okay, now, so they view this then as this is an expression of, he made all the angels of every class. Okay, so you've got your archangels and your other angels, and I'm not sure what the next other classes are, but there are multiple classes of angels, okay? Now, that is all developed, especially in the writings of Enoch as pseudepigraphic literature. So that's where you do find those. There's only one problem, is that stuff's nuts, okay? It's the professional word for it, nuts. So my point is, you can't trust it as for theology, but it's kind of popular to do so a lot, to incorporate it because of the language. Here's the thing you have to look at, though, and we want to back up then to look biblically at where did they come up with this? Well, let me present the problem, and trust me, this is all actually on point for Colossians. You just don't see it, and you're questioning me in your eyes right now. It's related. So what you had, here's the Jewish problem when you don't have the New Testament. Okay, so before Jesus, here's your problem. You're reading and trying to understand two things. You're trying to understand the angel of the Lord throughout Scripture. Appears to Abraham. Appears, looks like, to Jacob. Different times with Israel. Okay, Samson's parents. You've got all these instances. And of course, the problem in those instances are you've got one called the angel of the Lord, who is then speaking with the authority of the Lord and then being treated as the Lord and sometimes spoken of as the Lord, not just an angel. Confusing. You also find that in Daniel, in the visions, you see at the end, particularly that last vision, you have references to Gabriel and Michael. Gabriel and Michael in Daniel. Now from this, they cobbled together, and this is just one strain of thought, but essentially, and there is a book that's been written on the subject, The Great Angel. And so they classified then seeing the angel Lord as being this great angel, because they recognized this is different. There were not very many angels that are mentioned in the Old Testament. You have the two that appeared with the angel of the Lord that then went on in chapter Genesis 18 that went on to go and warn and help Lot and his family. Okay, you have that instance. You don't have a lot of situations of that happening. Then you come back to some of this later literature in the prophets, that is, especially the apocalyptic prophets, Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and all of a sudden you see all this. They really, understand why Daniel, this is Kevin's theory. Daniel would have been very, very important as a book for the development of this other literature for a simple reason. The prophecies of Daniel walked them through their history from the time of Daniel's life all the way through, the end of the Medo-Persian Empire, Alexander the Great coming on the scene, his empire, his dying early, being divided up into under 4 generals, those who were not his children. And then they're dividing them, then this actually having 2 becoming prominent and warring together regularly, and each one of those kind of wars being presented in Daniel chapter 11. Okay? Until you get to the middle of the chapter, which is Antiochus Epiphanes. Remember what I said about when all this literature started being written? It's when they basically declared their independence from Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a Seleucid leader, and gained some measure of freedom. They started writing. Daniel had predicted all of this, including the Maccabees, who were responsible for that rebellion. Now, that's your background. You've been following along in Daniel, watching history unfold. From the end, the last portion, which people argue about in chapter 11, Cliff Notes version, it's talking about Rome. Because he's already established that there are four kingdoms. Okay? Just to be even literarily, to make sense, you have to have a direction going toward Rome. That's the end of chapter 11. Everything after that's talking about what's going on in Rome, leading up into the establishment of the kingdom. Now, so you go through and you see that. But for them, now, they're looking at this, and that's when Michael stands up. Okay, so Gabriel introduced all this in chapter 10 before this, but you can see why Daniel would mean that much to them, because it basically was a book about them. They're just waiting for the next part. So from that, you have a lot of copycats write things similar to or expansion of Daniel. Bel and the Dragon is a direct expansion. Again, it's ridiculous, but what now? It is fan fiction. Yes, thank you, David. That's a good way to put it. It's fan fiction about Daniel. It's evidence that what I'm saying did exist, and that really Enoch and several other works were the same thing, just more extensive. Okay. All right, with all of that, I wanted to show you that the Jewish ideas of angelology were way developed. They had all these kind of different hierarchies and stuff, and that it came from this literature. This literature, when it comes down in chapter 2 and we're talking about philosophy, we always think he's talking about Greek philosophy. That's not what the word meant during this time. It was a seeking after knowledge from essentially scholarly sources. But the rest of it that's all follows is all about Judaism. So how do you put that together? They were appealing to Jewish scholarly sources. And therefore, some of their problems. That gives this a little bit different flavor. Why? Because and I still think that the government approach is possible, but by having this wording the way the Jews worded it, this would have been what this literature claimed Jesus was actually a part of. They wanted to diminish him, and, well, he can't be God. Maybe he was this. And for further reference, this is also the same essential background of why you get the angelology references in Hebrews 1 and 2, because they're dealing with a similar problem. Because it's developing within this period of time. The reasons why, if you want to read a paper that will put you to sleep, I've got one. But that's the price you have to pay. Right, so you have that as background. Now we look at verse 16, or the end of verse 16. All things were created through him and for him. Now, this is interesting. I said before that it says were created by means of him, remember, at the beginning of the verse? He comes at the end of the verse and says, through him. That's a different word. It's a different preposition. Very small difference. Both have the idea of saying an intermediary position, but still creating. So it's important because it never takes away from God the Father's position. That's what this does. What Jesus does in creating in no way diminishes the Father's position and role. He then puts by means of, which is an impersonal way to describe creation, as the means. So he's describing him as the power behind creation. And now as the close, when he says all things were created through him, right? And that's actually, all things through him is the first thing it's said in the original. That's a person. He was not just a force. There was an impersonal force involved in creation. It was a person as an intermediary involved in creation. That bolsters the understanding of personhood within the Godhead. Okay? I know that's some detail that you probably were not ready for, but it's really powerful in here. All things were created through him. So now we come back and when he says all things, what does he include in that? It's a trick question. What now? Okay, they're going to be part, that would be by implication. Everything's seen and unseen. Okay. Within the context here, the reason why I want to show this is you have to stick with the context of where he's laying this out, because otherwise when you go what I call as a universal, you end up with a universal thing and you take the language beyond what was intended. and I'm going to be really cheeky here by the way I point this out. Okay, did Jesus create evil? It's contrary to the nature of God. He's a too pure eyes to behold evil. Habakkuk 1:13. So you've got a problem there. I'm just offering that as a way to make sure you don't overstate the meaning and contextualize these big phrases. It's still huge what he's talking about. Now, maybe we have time to introduce this last part. All things were created through him and for him. That's a tough word. I mean, it is and it isn't. It's the same word you've heard before, ace, right? You hear it from Acts 2:38, ace. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean because of, good. What does it mean? It's pointing to purpose, unto this end. So what does that tell you? Oh, well, we don't know. We'll have to wait till next week to find out the mystery. I know that was technical today. I hope there were some things in there, though, that made you think and maybe broaden some knowledge and deepen some knowledge. Yes. I love the way you summarize. Yes. They had, and that's going to come up in chapter 2 specifically. Yes. She said they had a big thing for angels, and Paul was saying, stop it. Excellent review. Excellent.